Ruth. We didn't get to finish chapter 1 last week, but we're going to see how far we get today. Some of the things that we looked over, we began the section verses chapter 1, verses 6 through 18. So I want to just, as a reminder, before we move to the second half of that, read with you verses 6 through 14. Ruth 1:6 says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." And she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. So here we see, just as a reminder, Naomi is making these arguments about how continuing with her instead of turning back is unreasonable. And she's arguing from the past, the present, and the future. There's just no reason at any time that she can think of that it would be reasonable, that it would be worthwhile, that they would find any value in staying with her. There's no value, basically, in staying with me. It's something has been taken from all of us, and there is no possible way I can restore it. She begins talking about her ability to bear children, sons, for them to marry. Speaking of levirate marriage, as it was in Deuteronomy, and we'll get to what all that is later on in our study. But basically, she's saying, there is no way I'm going to be able to restore to you what's been taken. So when she's talking about this, she's basically saying what you deserve is restoration. What I want for you is restoration. I can't get it. There's no redemption here with me. I can't buy it back. I can't restore it. There's no escape if you stay with me. There's no freedom if you stay with me. Orpah is convinced, and she leaves. Verse 13 mentions bitterness. Naomi feels bitter, and this again will come up later on in the chapter. It's another important word as you read through. There's this sense of going from bitterness to pleasant, empty to full. Verse 20, we see this bitterness again as Naomi renames herself amongst those who know her, Mara, which means bitterness. What do you see there in the verse as her reason for bitterness? Okay, she lost her family, her husband and her two sons. The hand of the Lord has gone out against her. It's interesting, at least in the wording here, the way that it's phrased. It is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake. What does that tell you about some of the bitterness that she feels? You ever been in such a bad state that when people offer you help and consolation and comfort, offer to sit with you in your desperate state. You feel bad for them for having to sit there with you in it. She feels bitter, not just that the hand of the Lord is against her. It's not just bitterness against God for herself. She feels bitter for their sake, that because God's hand is against her, they're being influenced by it. And that bitterness is part of the reason, I believe, that convinces Orpah to leave. You probably experience it with people who are grieving a great loss, who they need comfort, they need consolation, but at the same time they will tell you, I don't want anybody to feel bad on my account. I don't want you to have to go through the same suffering I'm going through. Just leave, because it's making me feel worse. What do we do in those situations? Some of us leave. It's reasonable to leave. Some of us stay. Ruth chooses to stay, to cling to Naomi, and she gives her reasons in the next section here. And ultimately, after Ruth gives her reasons, Naomi is just, okay, I've said my piece. I'm not going to say anymore. So Ruth ends up staying with her. What does this section here, these short verses, what do they tell us about Naomi's faith in God? How would you describe it? Or wavering? Yeah, for sure. That's a good word. Wavering. Or if faith is maybe too loaded a word, her relationship with God. Shaky, wavering, unsure, doubting. She's doubting. She doesn't have as much trust. That bitterness. If you put something bitter in your mouth, what does that make your face do? You turn away. That's a feeling that you have sometimes. This is how she feels about her relationship with God. Oh, it's bitter. That makes it hard to want to be in a relationship if that relationship is causing you bitterness. So she's seeing what's going on in her life, and she's seeing God not being kind as he is describes himself. He's a source of that bitterness. And yet, at the same time, she's still turning toward home. She's turning toward Bethlehem, the source of the bread, the food that God is providing. She recognizes what God is offering. And though she is struggling in her relationship, she hasn't let go, I don't think. So here we are with 10 years. We read in the text that Naomi and Orpah and Ruth were all living there in Moab. And Ruth sticks by her side. She clings to her, and she begins making some vows. Let's read together the end of verse 14, and through 18. Ruth clung to her, and she said, Naomi said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said to her, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there will I be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So she's making these vows. Do you see anything about Ruth's character in this? What does this tell us about her conversion, maybe her relationship or her faith in this God? Yeah, so she's, for whatever reason, over that course of 10 years, Naomi's faith has likely had a big influence, but not only on her children, but on the spouses of her children. Ruth has seen something worthwhile in this family who serves this God, and she is willing to put all her eggs in that basket, so to speak. We mentioned last week about counting the cost, right? Naomi's laid out the cost. I've got nothing to offer you but this God that's made me bitter. And Ruth says, I'm gonna go. She clings to her. The same word that we see all the way back in Genesis chapter 2, the same word for the connection between a husband and a wife. That clinging to, that sticking to. I'm not suggesting they're getting married, but look at the words she uses. It's the same type of oath. It's the same type of vows that husbands make to wives. She is saying in verse 17, till death do us part. You ever heard that before? In what context would you have heard those words? In weddings, right? This is what Ruth is saying to Naomi. I am going to stick with you. And she swears this covenant to Naomi in the name of God. When you're making a vow before God, you are making the vow to God. No matter what, till death do we part, I am going to cling to you. And when we get to the next chapter here, and down along verse 12, Boaz speaks of her seeking refuge in God. So this making this oath to God and to stick to Naomi suggests that she had some understanding of who this God was, and that he would be a place to seek refuge in. What about, we can look back and see Naomi's prayer for Orpah and Ruth before she goes along and tries to convince them to leave. Compare Naomi's prayer to God to Ruth's oath before God. Naomi says, may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband. Compare that to what Ruth is saying here. May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. What do you see different? What do you see the same in those two statements made before God? Well, they're both being spoken before the Lord, and that phrase that Ruth uses there is a phrase that we see often during this time period in the Old Testament. It's kind of a phrase to say, "God, bring curses on me if I don't fulfill this. God, bring me death," or whatever it might be. Ruth just says, "May the Lord do so to me, and more also, if I don't do this." In other words, this is the oath that I'm making. We as kids might say, stick a needle in my eye. But this is much higher than that. She's making the oath before God. But I see Naomi praying for blessings of kindness on Orpah and Ruth. And it's not necessarily conditioned on their leaving her, but is it with the expectation that they will leave? Her prayer to the Lord is, bless them as they part. What's Ruth's prayer? What's her oath? May I never part. Now, if both of these women are speaking to God in this way, and we see these two completely different mindsets, I'm praying to God that you're blessed as you leave. Basically, leave so God can bless you. And Ruth saying, no, I'm staying right here, and may God curse me if I leave. Is there any way for any kind of reconciliation between these two ideas? Can both of these things happen? It's interesting. It doesn't seem like there's any way, especially according to Naomi, that Ruth can stay with her. And what is the blessing? That God would grant them rest in the house of their husband. She's not going to find a husband in Bethlehem. That's what Naomi and Ruth are both thinking. And yet, God grants the prayer of Naomi through Ruth. Of course, you know the story. She does find a husband. She does find rest. God blesses her with great kindness. And at the same time, Ruth fulfills her vow. She doesn't leave Naomi. And so there's a lot of tension as you read through Ruth. And yet God is still at work behind the scenes. And he's doing things that just don't seem possible to us. Again, we don't see God, acting the way he has in Genesis and Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers, Deuteronomy and Joshua and Judges. We don't see all of that miraculous big actions. This is just daily life, facing daily hardships. And yet, where things seem impossible to us and we don't know how things are going to work out, God is still working, although it's not the big miraculous things, through his providence. God is bringing about his plans, and we can see that even as the story is setting up, that there doesn't seem to be any possible way for these things to be reconciled. What do you think about these words of Ruth and Naomi? What do they do for the story that's being told in Ruth? In other words, what lessons can we learn thus far from Ruth? Yeah, so Naomi presented a great example of a God-fearing, God follower, and that influenced Ruth. People are watching us. Mm. Yeah, we might have friends and family members who are Moabites, and they might be won over by our continued service to the Lord. I think, yeah, it's good. Yeah, it doesn't. The text doesn't say that she did. It seems like she's making rational choices, and I don't have any reason to doubt that God wouldn't bless her, as Naomi prayed for her as well. It seems in this story of Ruth, we have people making rational decisions, and we would say those are good choices. There's nothing wrong with some of these choices. We can argue about points that we don't know how they unfold, but in this story we get not just the Orpahs and later on the close kinsmen, but we get Boaz and Ruth who go above and beyond with this overwhelming loyalty and kindness that is just far beyond what is expected. And I think those are good examples for us to not necessarily in our lives draw a line. I'm going to do this until this happens. My love, my service of God is conditional. I can only extend myself this much. Sometimes we need to have a little more faith in God that he can do more than we can possibly expect through us. Yes, sir. Hmm. Yeah, so look at what God can do with this little bit of faithfulness, right? It's that mustard seed faith that God can do amazing things with. They don't even know uh, the Messiah is going to come through them. They probably wouldn't even know, grasp what that meant. But here we see God working in this little bit of faithfulness during a time of hardship and trial, using that faithfulness to bring about salvation for everyone, which is amazing. God can use us. What is the Lads to Leaders theme for the year? God can, yeah, God meant it for good. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good. Even our hardships. It is interesting too that there's trauma in these ladies' life, and trauma affects everybody differently. And I think in Ruth and Naomi, you see a little bit of a different response to trauma. There's a bitterness and questioning in Naomi. And yet in Ruth, there seems to be this grasping for hope that she's not willing to let go and turn her back on Naomi. Well, we could continue on with that for a while. Let's look at the last few verses of the chapter 19 through 22. So the two of them went on their way until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the women said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi. Call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, and the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. And they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest. So what are they doing here? What is the big move in this section? Yeah, so they're coming back to Bethlehem, right? They're coming, they're going, they're winting, they're caming, whatever you want to say. Do you see some big contrasts that Naomi herself is presenting here? What are the contrasts that you see? Look at 21, for example. Full and empty. I left full, came back empty. I left Naomi, which means pleasant. I left Naomi. I come back Mara. I come back bitter, no longer pleasant. And it's interesting. She says she left full. Do you remember why they left? A famine. How was she full? She had her family. Her stomach may have been empty. They were worried about, where they're going to get their next meal. But the way she's describing the situation is she was full. And now all she can see, despite God blessing his people with food, all she can see is the emptiness of the great loss that she had. And she still doesn't seem to have any more hope. Again, we mentioned last week, return. That word is used 15 times in the book of Ruth, 12 times in this chapter. Return, return, go back, brought me back, return, returned, again and again and again, including the last verse here, which is an interesting verse because it's speaking about Ruth the Moabite, the daughter-in-law, who returned. How does Ruth return? Now, it could be that I'm just picking on this word, but doesn't return mean that you've been there before? She can't come back to a place. she's not been. Is there anything to that? Now, I also should point out it says, so Naomi returned and Ruth returned. So there's definitely a connection being made between Naomi and Ruth. This chapter seems to be, it's fairly obvious that this chapter is about Naomi, right? This is about her struggle. It's from her perspective. This is her feelings about how everything is going. But here in the last verse, there's this connection being made. We're being set up for the next chapter. We're going to shift gears and go from Naomi's return to what she returned with, Ruth, who has returned with her. And it becomes a story not just of return, but of restoration. And it happens, the restoration that happens in the story happens for Naomi, but it's because Ruth returned with her. So again, there's a lot to do here with this word return. And although it might not necessarily have the depth of meaning that she's been to Bethlehem and now she's coming back, there is definitely a connection being made between Naomi and her return and redemption and restoration, and Ruth and her return and restoration. So we've got them both coming back from Moab, and they just happen to be arriving at the beginning of the barley harvest. Again, we're going to see the actual words in the next chapter that just happened, but we're being told what's going on. This is the setup for the next chapter. It's the beginning of the barley harvest. I want to look at one more thing that seems to be important in storytelling in the Old Testament, and that is the use of names. People's names carry some significance, and it's not always just what the parents are going through. Their name seems to have echoes in their life story. And let me show you what I mean here. Elimelech, that's the guy who begins this whole episode. It's his family that leaves Bethlehem. Elimelech, that means God is king. Eli, God, Melech, king. God is my king. Again, we're introduced to God is king, Elimelech, in the very first verses, right? Do you remember what the last verse of Judges says? In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. If you're reading straight from Judges into Ruth, you read that verse and then you read, God is king. Here's a story about God as king. It's interesting. It gives you goosebumps, doesn't it? When you realize what's going to happen in this story and the sovereignty of God here, despite how everybody is behaving, despite everybody living like there is no king, God is king. God is king. So there's Elimelech coming onto the scene. By the way, it appears that because of the last few verses of Ruth set up the lineage for who? King David. This is all about there's a king, right? Judges is there's no king. Here we have there is a king. Judges, this is during the time of Judges when people thought to themselves, there is no king. We can do whatever we want. What does that tell you about Elimelech's parents? They must have thought a little bit differently, right? They must have had a different idea. Maybe everybody's going around actually saying this phrase, there's no king. We can do whatever we want. Elimelech's parents apparently wanted everybody to know when they spoke to their son, they'd have to say, God is king. God is king. That is, again, in a time when people acted as if there wasn't a king. So we got Elimelech here. We see that he's an Ephrathite. Bethlehem is where they're from. Another name for it is Ephrathah. I think I said this before. Ephra. I know that I could not say it before because I can't say it now. Bethlehem is house of bread. Ephrathah is fruitfulness. This is where they live. They live in a place of fruitfulness in Bethlehem, but there's a famine in the house of bread. There's a famine in the land of fruitfulness. Well, we've got God is king and his wife, Naomi. You remember what his wife's name means? Oh, it's up there. No? Pleasant. Good. Yeah. Pleasant or delight. And that name, again, it's important as we continue to read. Delight turns to bitterness. Pleasantness turns to emptiness. So that's Naomi. Mahlon, sick, sickly, weakness. Can you imagine naming your kid weakling? What would have to be going on in your life to name your firstborn son weakling? And then Kilion, pining. You ever been pining? Or you got some heartache because of the good old days that you've left behind. They're pining, which can also mean destruction or annihilation. This is what God is king and pleasant named their two sons. If nothing else, I mean, we know what happens to them, but it tells you a little bit about maybe what their parents were going through before they left the house of bread. I don't know about Boaz. Ruth and Naomi are also unclear. Ruth and Orpah. They're not as clear because they are obviously Moabites, and it's hard to tell whether this name has been attached to this word or vice versa, and what came from what. But Ruth means friend, as far as can be understood. Is Ruth act as a friend in this story? I think it's a fitting name for Ruth, if that is what that name means. Orpah means nape, as in the nape of the neck, which is also interesting because what does Naomi see as Orpah leaves? Back of her neck. She turns around. Again, not as certain, but we do have in this story Bethlehem, the house of bread. They leave because of the famine. Here goes Pleasant with her family leaving the house of bread, and they end up in Moab. Does anybody remember the story of Moab, where he came from? Lot and his daughter. His daughter, Lot leaves Sodom, and his daughter says, there's nobody left for us. We have to preserve the human race. So let's sleep with our father. Do you see her in her thought process taking the role of God? I have to preserve myself. Moab means son of her father. I mean, they're carrying that as they're referred to themselves as Moabites. They know where they come from. But basically, we get these people who are leaving because there's a famine in the land of bread, and they're going somewhere to preserve themselves to the land of people who are existing because their forefathers were trying to preserve themselves and willing to do anything to do it. Eventually, they leave. They leave the son of her father, and they come back bitter. They leave pleasant, and they come back bitter to the house of bread. And all of this is, it doesn't pop off the page to us, does it? Because we don't speak Hebrew. But just to give you a little behind the scenes peek at how an ancient Israelite might read this story. It's a pleasant family who claims God is king, leaves the house with him sickness and destruction. They move to a land of self-preservation, while their pleasantness turns to bitterness after she loses her family, except for one friend who returns with her to find refuge in the house of bread once again. Again, that's just from what we've read thus far based on the names. Isn't that isn't that powerful? That's powerful to me. I just love how much depth there is to God's word. I think that there are more lessons here that come out just by looking into the names, that adds texture and perspective and an idea of what's going on in this story, just by looking at some of these names that are given by family or any other people. Uh, Before we move on to chapter 2, does anybody have any questions or comments? Boaz is another name that comes up. His name is also uncertain. So I can't tell you much about that one either. Yes, sir.
Just echo what you just said, Josh. I said this over and over again through the years. One of the things that convinces me that the Bible is indeed God's inspired word is what you just said. The deepness of it, the breadth of it, the richness of it. Using these names to tell a story like this. No other book is written like that. No other book has the tremendous riches in it. And we never can plumb the depth of those riches in a lifetime. And I would say in probably 5 lifetimes if we had the opportunity.
Yeah.
We would not plumb the total depth of the riches of Scripture. It could not have been written. It was written by men, but by men who were inspired by God. It had to be written. It had to be essentially written by God. That over and over. I mean, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, we learn things if we pay attention that teach us that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's we can never fully plumb the depths of wisdom and knowledge that come from Scripture, and it's beautifully pictured here, just with these names. And again, you might not first realize all of these things, but when you do see it, you say, "Oh yeah, they were just trying to preserve themselves, and they do come back empty. But what are they empty of? Sickness." I mean, it is her children. Granted, there would be a feeling of emptiness and sorrow, but the names tell you they've lost along their way sickness and pining as they come back to the Lord. Yeah. Yes, sir. That is a good question. Is it the Feast of Weeks? Yeah, the week comes next. So we will. I think we looked at the Pentecost as being traditionally when, like Ruth was attached to the Pentecost. As they celebrate that day, they're all going to sit down and read Ruth because it's a time of harvest. But perhaps specifically here, this is a time to celebrate the Feast of Weeks. And I think we're going to see another attachment to the Feast of Weeks in chapter 2 as we continue reading. So, yeah, that's a good question. Homework next week. Look up barley harvest and see if that falls during the Feast of Weeks. Anything else? All right, chapter 2, as we've got so much time. Chapter 2 here, we're moving to Ruth's story. She becomes more prominent. We're introduced to Boaz. We're told Naomi's faith is weakening, but here towards the end, though she is running empty in her relationship toward God, so to speak, she is going to be brought back, turned around. Let's look at the first 3 verses. Naomi had a relative of her husband's, a worthy man of the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the field and glean among the ears of grain after him whose sight I shall find favor." And she said to her, "Go, my daughter." So she set out and went and gleaned in the field after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the clan of Elimelech. Okay, so we're introduced to more family here. There's a particular repetition. Do you see a repetition in these first three verses? What is it? Well, yeah, Elimelech. Elimelech is in here. God is king. That keeps pointing back to family, right? He says it three times. This is a relative of her husband. Clan of Elimelech. Clan of Elimelech. Who is that guy? Boaz. Boaz is his name. So we're introduced to him. Why do you think it's important? Right, by the way, when you see something repeated in Scripture over and over, especially in close proximity, that's highlighting, that's underlining, that's emphasis. That's the way Scripture emphasizes something. So here we see three times at least. This is underlined. Why is it important that we know? Whoop. Now we got 5 minutes. I mean, we know Naomi's coming back to Bethlehem, right? We know she must have family here, and this is definitely telling us that, right? She has family here. Do you think there might be some foreshadowing going on? Do you think people know who Naomi is? She's got family. We know she left with her husband and their two sons. She's got her own parents, maybe grandparents, uncles, aunts, cousins, all kinds of family, all of the clan or the family of Elimelech. Maybe here we're also to think, what do we need to be aware of in this chapter? Something is going to happen with the family of Naomi. We need to know for some reason that here is Naomi's family. She has a lot of family here, Elimelech's family. In verse 20, Boaz is referred to as one of their redeemers. Now, we'll get to that as we continue. Do you see any other, if you're just glancing over the chapter, last chapter, the big repeated word was return. If you just look through there, do you see another word that is repeated? It's glean. Oh, we're going to run out of time. I'll just tell you. It's glean. Gleaned, the same word, used over and over again. That word is used 37 times in the Old Testament. It's used 12 times in Ruth. In chapter 2, it's used 12 times. That's interesting for such a small book. A third of the times this word is used. It makes me think, okay, what does Scripture have to say about gleaning? What does this word even mean? I've got an idea about what it means as I read the story. You know, you're gathering in the sheaves. You're cutting down the barley, the wheat. You're gathering those things in. But what about other times in Scripture where this is used? It's interesting. Exodus 16 speaks of God's provision for his people when they're wandering in the desert. They are to go out and glean what? Manna. God provides for them as they go out and glean. That's interesting. Leviticus 19, 19 verse 9 and 10. Let me read that for you. It says, "When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest, and you shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord your God." Now, we see this law being carried out in this story, right? They are leaving things behind. Ruth is going out and gleaning what's left behind. This is God's welfare for those who are poor and destitute. They can come into the fields, and God's people are meant to leave some for the poor. It's interesting, this passage here culminates, this Leviticus 19 culminates in the law in verse 19, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." Jesus has something to say about that law, doesn't he? Second most important law? Is it possible that Ruth is teaching us something about the second most important law? The greatest command? Love your neighbor as yourself. God is providing this law which allows them to show neighbor love, and this neighbor love saves Ruth. Leviticus 23:22. This is speaking of the Feast of Weeks. I knew it was going to come up again. Pentecost. This is during the Feast of Weeks, during Pentecost. This is how you are to worship. And then there's a verse down at the end after it tells you how to worship, and that verse seems to switch topics suddenly, but let me read what it says. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to the edge, nor shall you gather the gleanings after your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. Isn't that interesting? If this does fall, especially if it falls in the time of the Feast of Weeks, this is what they're doing. They're gathering so that they can worship the Lord, and God says, make sure you leave some for the poor. Now, he's already said that, but now during the Feast of Weeks, make sure, why is it important to God that you leave some for the poor? So they can eat or so they can worship? God's providing a means not just for neighbor love, but for thanksgiving, for worship. Deuteronomy 24, Deuteronomy 10, they don't use this word specifically, but speak about the same law. You know, we'll come back to this next week. We'll stop there, and I'll just give you some reminders to pull you up to speed next week. Thanks for your attention.